More questions tonight about the alleged terrorist plot aimed at the BC legislature. The best friend of one of the suspects say he doesn't think the couple accused could have organized such an elaborate plan.
A terror plot eerily similar to the Boston Marathon, and once again, potential weapon made of an ordinary kitchen pot, a pressure cooker.
It's time right now for parliamentarians to act, to give law enforcement the tools that they need.
After the Boston bombing and the news that young Canadians had joined an Al-Qaeda-linked attack in Algeria, the government suddenly rediscovered its bill.
Preventing, countering, and prosecuting terrorism is a priority for our government.
Last month, 17 suspects were arrested in Ontario on terrorism-related charges. Tonight, an in-depth interview with a man who says he infiltrated the group that was allegedly behind the plan to bomb sites in Toronto and Ottawa and even behead the Prime Minister. He was working all along with CSIS and the RCMP and says the ultimate takedown of the suspects happened because of help from Canada's Muslim community.
He was concerned about 3 or 4 so-called Muslim brothers who began hanging out with Nuttall around the time police alleged the conspiracy was hacked.
They believe the plot was supported by Al-Qaeda. How significant is that?
Well, it's actually just about as significant as you can imagine. Radicalized.
They may have been radicalized.
Terrorism.
Terrorists in the Toronto area.
Terrorists in Toronto.
Violence and even terrorism, or at least that's the allegation.
Today's arrests demonstrate that terrorism continues to be a real threat to Canada.
On July 1st, the RCMP arrested and charged John Stuart Nuttall and Amanda Cordy for terrorism-related activities for the purpose of causing death or serious bodily injuries on Canada Day.
We need to continue to work together as law enforcement and community partners with mutual trust and with the intent of causing it, and understanding.
Good afternoon, folks. Dan Dix here, reporting for Press for Truth. And today I'm here to inform you that right now, the Canadian people are being conditioned for an attack. Now, this conditioning is not coming from Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or any other faction of so-called Islamic extremism, but rather it's coming from our very own government through a network of criminal elements within the intelligence communities who have an agenda to generate fear in the minds of the Canadian people. One would think that with the recent onslaught of all these foiled terror plots, there must be an ongoing threat from either outside forces or from radicalized, homegrown domestic extremists, as we're being led to believe. However, in each and every circumstance, we are finding that there is a hidden hand, and in its grip lies a nefarious motive to generate the fear of an attack in the minds of the masses. The attacks on September 11th, 2001 have paved the way for Orwellian and downright draconian pieces of legislation to be passed into law. The Patriot Act has robbed American citizens of their civil liberties, and here in Canada, the government passed Bill C-36, the Anti-Terrorism Act, which contains provisions that allow for preemptive detentions, secret trials, and a wide and broadening expansion of the Big Brother surveillance control grid. And so, under the guise of keeping us safe, our government began the incremental process of convincing Canadians that civil liberties must be sacrificed in exchange for security. In 2006, Canadians were shocked to learn of the now infamous Toronto 18, a group of young men who were allegedly planning on blowing up the CN Tower, taking over the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and beheading the Prime Minister. At the time, the front page of every newspaper said, "Homegrown terror has arrived." Meanwhile, it was months after the fact that Canadians learned of the involvement by the RCMP and CSIS through an informant who coerced and entrapped these young men into getting far more deeply involved than they otherwise would have been.
The former Army cadet and reservist quickly won the confidence of the leaders in an emerging plot that eventually included attacks on prominent Canadians, Parliament, the Toronto Stock Exchange, and the CBC. They eventually asked him to direct a 10-day winter training program in guerrilla tactics in rural Ontario. The training included simulated attacks on individuals, basic combat techniques, and target practice. Early in June, the police broke up what they considered to be a serious terror conspiracy. The plot had escalated, eventually involving the purchase of material which could have been used for making bombs.
Exactly 1 week after the Boston bombings, 2 suspects were arrested in Canada for allegedly planning on blowing up a Via Rail train which was en route from Toronto to New York. While appearing in a Toronto courthouse, suspect Rahid Jasser maintained that he is innocent, and he stated that he, quote, plans to defend himself vigorously. I questioned the lawyer of the suspect and asked him whether or not his client was contacted or infiltrated by a CSIS informant. And I also asked him why is it that the FBI are involved in this Canadian case.
The accusations are very serious. What evidence there is to support that remains to be seen.
He was monitored for the last year. Was there any contact during that time, or were there any CSIS informants who infiltrated the group?
Once again, I have no comment on the evidence.
Can you tell us why the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security are involved?
I can't comment on that, and frankly, I don't know.
The 2 men are 30-year-old Shahab Izagayr of Montreal and 35-year-old Rahid Jasser of Toronto. They were allegedly planning to derail a Via Rail passenger train with the help of Al-Qaeda. Authorities have thwarted would-be terrorists before, most notably the Toronto 18 who plotted to attack prominent buildings. But this is the first one, authorities say, that has a direct Al-Qaeda link.
On Canada Day, 2 suspects were arrested for allegedly planning on detonating pressure cooker bombs outside of the BC legislature. RCMP Assistant Commissioner Wayne Rideout stated that the Integrated National Security Enforcement Team had used a variety of complex investigative covert techniques. One of the techniques that they've employed is referred to as the Mr. Big Sting operation. Corey Keenan, a PhD criminology student who co-authored Mr. Big, Exposing Undercover Operations in Canada, described it as a technique which involves undercover cops who pose as members of a criminal organization to target unwitting suspects by creating various scenarios in which they will befriend and earn their trust. The scenarios typically have the group pulling off supposed crimes and are done to lure in the target with the promise of an exciting lifestyle and easy money. The phony criminals also preach a message that those who betray the gang will face a swift and harsh penalty from their well-connected and feared crime boss. The operation culminates with the so-called Mr. Big having a series of face-to-face meetings with the suspect, who is told that in order to fully join the organization, he must admit to his role in the crime being investigated so that the group can clean up any loose ends and avoid any heat. The undercover officer creates the scenarios. He lures in and coerces the target through bribery and intimidation, and then he records their so-called confession.
These charges are the result of an RCMP investigation named Project Souvenir, which was launched in February 2013, based on information received from the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. While the RCMP believes that this threat was real, at no time was the security of the public at risk. These individuals were inspired by Al-Qaeda ideology. Our investigation demonstrated that this was a domestic threat without international linkages.
According to the RCMP, John Stuart Nuttall and his common-law wife Amanda Anacordy were the masterminds behind the plot to build these pressure cooker bombs and blow them up on Canada Day in Victoria. Self-radicalized terrorists inspired by Al-Qaeda ideology. But Nuttall's best friend believes that was impossible.
He didn't have the money, he didn't have transportation, he didn't have the means.
Nelson says Nuttall has the mentality of a 16-year-old. Instead, he says he was concerned about 3 or 4 so-called Muslim brothers who began hanging out with Nuttall around the time police alleged the conspiracy was hatched. 6 months ago, after Nuttall was kicked out of this Surrey mosque over an unknown religious dispute. Nelson says the men constantly visited Nuttall's nearby apartment, driving a new silver or black pickup and a red car.
They were coming by his house every other day. One of them employed him at a furniture store, apparently, got him delivering packages. None of these people I've actually seen surface, come up and say anything or come forward. They've just disappeared. And I just find that suspicious.
The Canadian government has a history of using undercover police officers as agent provocateurs who will commit crimes in order to set up their intended targets. When I was in Montebello, Quebec in 2007, 3 undercover police officers were caught red-handed acting as violent agent provocateurs.
What happened in Montebello was the people in 2007, in August, in Montebello, Quebec, were fed up with this 2.5-year-old trade deal, going forward and merging every aspect of their society and harmonizing the regulations to the lowest possible standards according to what corporations want. They were sick and tired of the information not being given out to the public, not being openly shared, and of not being given any input into what was happening with respect to this massive trade deal. So they massed in Montebello what looked to be about 1,000, 1,500 protesters. There was a security perimeter around the meeting, and there was incredible police presence there. And at one point, the police were even caught infiltrating the protest by 3 giant, muscle-bound, supposedly anarchists, wearing masks and holding rocks, were threatening to throw the rocks at the police.
No! Put the rock down, man!
A union leader stepped up and said, "Take off your masks, put down those rocks, you're not with us."
You're a fucking cop, the 3 of you! Go on, it's our line! These 3 guys are cops, everybody!
Eventually they ripped the masks off the guys, and the guys dove behind the police line. And that was all. It was caught on tape. It was exposed. They were exposed as infiltrators because they were wearing the same boots as the officers who arrested them. Plus, of course, who dives behind a police line for protection if you're a protester? It's something that most protesters would be scared to do, to dive into a bunch of police who are there, menacingly, staring at them.
As we confirmed yesterday, the 3 people in question were indeed Sûreté du Québec police officers performing their duties.
When we consider that with all these recent foiled terror plots, there was involvement by the RCMP and CSIS informants who set up and coerced these accused suspects, we need to ask ourselves, is there really a threat from terrorists? Or is it the Canadian government and the intelligence communities that we need to be wary of? Here in North America, the odds of dying in a terrorist attack are 1 in 20 million. And according to the Terrorist Risk Index, the odds of a Canadian terrorist attack are 1 in 14 million. That means that the odds of winning the lottery are more probable than having a terrorist attack here on Canadian soil. So, if there is no real threat, and even with all these recent foiled terror plots, we're now finding out that Canadians never were in any real danger, then why is it that we're seeing so much fear-mongering coming from the intelligence communities through the mainstream media? Well, it is because it is through fear that they gain their control. Fear increases budgets. Fear expands the surveillance state. And it is with fear that they can offer greater security in exchange for civil liberties. So ladies and gentlemen, as this war on terror inevitably continues, let us never forget that there is an agenda to manipulate the mindset of the Canadian people, so that if an attack does occur, the first thing they will think is terrorists or homegrown extremists. But the good news today, folks, is that their tactics are beginning to wear thin. More and more Canadians are beginning to see this for what it is. So we must remain vigilant. We must continue to watch the watchers. And let's put the government on notice that if an attack does occur, it will be the government and the criminal elements within the intelligence communities who are suspect number 1. This is Dan Dix reporting for Press for Truth. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and keep fighting the good fight.